Wind and solar are now the lowest cost form of generating electricity. And we see all over the world that, the IEA says that about 90% of electricity generation added in the 2020s will be wind or solar, except in Ontario, apparently, because the Ford government has served notice that it tends to repeal legislative provisions to prioritize renewable energy generation in the province. So we're going to talk to Professor Mark Winfield of York University and find out what's going on in Toronto. Mark, welcome to the interview.
Good afternoon.
Now, at first blush, this looks like a real head scratcher. Can you provide some insight for us, please?
Well, I don't think it's actually that much of a head scratcher within the context of the current government of Ontario's approach to these sorts of matters. I mean, we know it didn't like renewables, and it blamed the Green Energy Act for the increases in electricity costs that have occurred over the last decade. And in a sense, this is an extension of that sort of direction, that it's sort of kind of exterminating the last vestiges of the Green Energy Act, even though at the moment they really have no operational effect because we have zero renewable energy projects in the pipeline or under development in Ontario.
Well, there's a provision in the notice that I want to read because this, and I get your reaction to it. So going forward, Ontario will ensure value for ratepayers by allowing all resources to compete to meet system needs. Now, are we talking coal? Are we talking, what exactly do they mean by this?
Well, that's a very good question. Does this mean nuclear? Does this mean that we're going to open the question of whether or not the refurbishments of Bruce and Darlington actually make economic sense relative to the alternatives? I don't think so. I think this is a very, very specific dimension of things, that there had been some notions they might do a capacity market, but that will tend to be at the margin. I mean, certainly what we have now is not defined by any form of technological neutrality.
Now, I want to ask a question, Mark, because I interview experts in electricity system design, market design, and so on all over the world. So everybody is moving towards more renewables integration. And they point again and again and again to policy and regulatory design as being critical to reforming electricity systems to make them competitive in a low carbon economy, in a more competitive economy going forward. Ontario seems to be going in exactly the opposite direction. And that seems odd to me.
Well, I think it would seem odd to many people unless you happen to live in the world of Doug Ford in Ontario, that it does seem to turn its back very explicitly. I mean, the signal here is very, very clear that we're not interested in renewables. We're hostile to renewables. And yet the conversation around energy and energy transitions throughout the rest of North America and Western Europe, indeed most of the rest of the world, is completely the opposite, that we see renewables as the future. So it's a very, very strange signal to send, to put it mildly, in the context of where the overall energy conversation has been going. And effectively, it's Ontario saying we want nothing to do with that. We're somewhere else, which has no interest in engaging in these processes.
Again, another thing that seems odd is that over and over again, I'm told by experts in other jurisdictions that the economic success, the future economic success of their jurisdiction depends on an abundant source of clean, low-cost electricity, and which in today's context means wind, solar, and batteries or some kind of storage. So if that is the case, as it seems to be, then it would stand to reason that the Ford government is actually hobbling economic growth and investment going, over the next 10, 20 years with this kind of legislation.
Well, it certainly looks that way. I mean, it kind of declares the province to be a wasteland in terms of these sorts of directions around energy. which everybody else says is the leading edge, where we're going technologically, economically, and environmentally. And in effect, the government is saying we're not interested in any of that. We're not interested in being part of that. We reject it, which is, to put it frankly, kind of a bizarre position to be taking. I mean, we see what's happening in terms of energy costs. We see what's happening in Alberta, for example, around renewables procurement, where they've come in as the cheapest option. It makes no sense other than as a kind of weird political vendetta against renewables. And I don't think there's a whole lot more one can say about it in this context. I mean, there's not a lot of rational explanation for what's going on here.
Right. Not certainly doesn't appear to be evidence-based policymaking. One last question, Mark, and it was just last week that the President Joe Biden held his climate summit, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was there and promising to up Canada's climate ambitions to 40 to 45% emissions reductions over 2005 levels. So if the federal government is committed to reducing emissions even more than it had already planned, then Ontario's decision to, it appears, run natural gas power generators during the 2020s while Darlington and Bruce are down for refurbishment and Pickering comes offline, that seems to run afoul of the federal government's direction. And what do you make of that?
Yes, I think it's the short answer. Has the government of Ontario thought about these things in those terms? I think the answer is no. Is the short answer is that you're not dealing with a government that seems terribly concerned about climate change and is sort of ridden on the coattails in terms of broader environmental issues on the coal phase out. So my sense is that this just hasn't been thought through. I mean, the IESO has sort of expressed its preference to run the gas plants. And at the moment, there's certainly no signal coming from the political level to do anything different. And I think we're in the process of the penny sort of dropping potentially at the federal level in terms of what the implications of all of this might be. But so far, we haven't seen that much connecting of the dots.
Well, if the Ford government is worried about rates, electricity rates, and the Canadian government is raising the national carbon tax by 12, 13% a year, or sorry, $12 to $13 per ton a year, doesn't that suggest that the relying on the gas plants will actually lead to higher rates because there'll be the carbon tax applied to it?
Well, potentially, depending on how those charges are applied to the electricity sector and particularly to natural gas fired generation. But potentially, yes, this is embedding yet more additional costs relative to where we are now. And of course, we're already embedding enormous costs through the Darlington and Bruce refurbishment. So it's going to be very hard to keep rates down, except by the means that it's being done now, which is to artificially lower them by subsidizing them massively out of general revenues, which is an enormously costly strategy. I mean, the best estimates now in Ontario are already running in the range of $7 billion a year to keep electricity rates artificially low.
Mark, thank you very much for your insights. Always appreciated.
Well, thank you.